This screencast presents what I believe to be the easiest way to manage application state in React applications. My goals are to store state in one place that is outside of any component, allow components to access any part of the state, give components an opportunity to re-render if any state they depend on changes, make it easy for components to modify any part of the state, and do not require writing any new code to support new state data. There are many popular approaches to managing state in React applications. A few are described on the following slides. One approach is to hold application state in the topmost component and pass it down to descendant components using props. This has the downside that many components will need to accept and pass props that they do not actually use. A name given to this issue is prop drilling. When the component tree becomes deep, this approach does not scale well. Another state management approach is REDUX. REDUX uses a single store that can be thought of as a client-side database. Components obtain state through functions like map state to props. Components are able to request state changes through functions like map state to dispatch. Components create action objects and dispatch them. Reducer functions are given the current state and an action. They are responsible for returning the new state without mutating the current state. There are many sub-approaches to using Redux that involve concepts like thunks and sagas. In my view, these introduce unnecessary complexity. Another state management approach is the context API that is built into React. An application can create any number of context objects by calling the react.createContext function. A context can include both data and methods to update the data. Each context has a provider and a consumer. Provider elements are often rendered at the top of the component tree to make the context available to the entire application. Consumer elements wrap around the rendered JSX of components that need to access and update context data. Both Redux and the Context API have a bit of a learning curve. With both, new code must be written to support new state data. In the case of Redux, this involves modifying a reducer function. In the case of the Context API, this involves adding methods to the context. Redux always uses a single store, but parts of the store can be managed by different reducer functions that are combined into a single reducer function. The Context API supports creating multiple context instances that each manage subsets of the application data. A benefit of segregating application state in this way is that it becomes possible to know that only a subset of the components use and have the ability to modify a particular piece of state data. Segregating application state becomes messy if some components need to access state data from multiple subsets. Another way to think about this segregation of data access is to consider the implementation of REST services. Often REST services operate on tables in relational databases. It is not typical to attempt to restrict a REST service so it only has access to a subset of the database tables. In my opinion, attempts to segregate application state data make the code more complex for very little benefit. So how can we achieve the goals described earlier in the simplest possible way? ContextEasy is an open source library in NPM. As the name suggests, it builds on the Context API. It implements a provider that can manage all the state for a React application. It is highly generic, making it suitable for any application. The easiest way for components to use the ContextEasy provider is through the Use Context hook. If you're not yet familiar with React hooks, check out my video on the topic at the URL on the screen. Configuring the use of ContextEasy should be done in the topmost component. Often this is defined in source/app.js. 3 steps are required. The first is to import Easy Provider as shown here. The second is to define the initial state like the example shown here. The third step is to wrap the topmost component in an Easy Provider as shown here. Note how the initial state is passed to Easy Provider as a prop. In function components that need to access and/or modify application state, do the following. Import the Use Context hook and Easy Context as shown here. Get the context object inside the function component by calling useContext and passing it EasyContext. Access state from the context object, like the example shown here that uses destructuring. Finally, update state properties at specific paths by calling methods on the context object. The example shown here changes the state property at person.name. The context object implements 10 methods. Most of these take a path argument that is a string representing a dot-separated path into the application state. Let's review these in alphabetical order. The decrement method decrements the number at a given path. An optional second argument specifies the amount by which to decrement and defaults to 1. The delete method deletes the property at a given path. The filter method replaces the array at a given path with a new array that is the result of filtering the current elements. The function provided as the second argument is called on each array element and should return true for elements to be retained and false for elements to be filtered out. The increment method increments the number at a given path. An optional second argument specifies the amount by which to increment and defaults to 1. The log method writes the current state to the DevTools console. It outputs the string contextEasy : followed by an optional label that defaults to an empty string, the string state equals, and the state object. This object starts out in a collapsed view but can be expanded by clicking on the disclosure triangles to the left of the property names. The map method replaces the array at a given path with a new array. The function provided as the second argument is passed each array element one at a time. The new array will contain the return values of each of these calls. The push method replaces the array at a given path with a new array. The new array starts with all the existing elements and ends with all the specified new values. The set method, perhaps the most commonly used method, sets the value at a given path to the specified value. The toggle method toggles the Boolean value at a given path. And finally, the transform method sets the value at a given path to the value returned by passing the current value to the function provided as the second argument. These 10 context methods cover all the common ways to update state. The useContext hook subscribes components that call it to context state changes. This means that components will be re-rendered on every context state change. To only re-render components when specific context state properties are changed, wrap the component JSX in a call to the useCallback hook as shown next. For example, suppose a component only depends on the context state properties count and person.name. The following code for a function component will make it so the component is only re-rendered when those change. It is common to have input, select, and TEXTAREA elements with onChange handlers that get their value from event.target.value and update a specific path. An alternative is to use the provided input, select, TEXTAREA, RADIOBUTTONS, and CHECKBOXES components as shown on the following slides. All of these components take a path prop which is used to get the current value for the component and update the value at that path. HTML input elements can be replaced by the input component. The example here updates the path user.firstname. The type property defaults to text but can be set to any valid value, including checkbox. The value used by the input is the state value at the specified path. When the user changes the value, this component updates the value at that path. To perform additional processing of changes such as validation, supply an onChange prop whose value is a function. HTML TEXTAREA elements can be replaced by the TEXTAREA component, as in the example here that uses the value at the state path feedback.comment. HTML select elements can be replaced by the select component. In the example here, we want to update the state path favorite.color to a selected option. If the option elements have a value attribute, that value will be used instead of the text inside the option element. For a set of radio buttons, use the radio buttons component. In this example, we want to update the state property flavor to a selected radio button value. Radio button list is an array of objects that have text and value properties as shown here. When a radio button is clicked, the state property flavor will be set to the value of that radio button. For a set of checkboxes, use the checkboxes component. In the example here, we want to update properties for each of the checkboxes that are color.red, color.green, and color.blue. Checkbox list is an array of objects that have text and path properties. When a checkbox is clicked, the Boolean value at the corresponding path will be toggled between false and true. Let's create a small React app that demonstrates using Context Easy. This app supports multiple views, one for entering data and one for viewing the data. The user can click the Form and Report buttons to toggle between these views. Follow these steps to get started. Open a terminal window, enter Create React App Demo, change directory to Demo, enter npm run start, and verify that the initial app is running in the default browser. Now open a new terminal and install Context Easy by entering npm install context-easy. Implement a form component by creating the file source/form.js. Use an input component with the path user.name as shown here. Notice how simple this component is. We are getting two-way binding between the input and the context state very easily. Implement a report component by creating the file source/report.js and render the value at context.user.name. Notice how easy it is to get state from the context. This component will automatically re-render whenever the context state changes. Implement a top component by creating the file source/top.js. Use the value of context.route to decide whether a form or a report component should be rendered. This provides a very simple routing approach for applications where the URL does not need to change when the view changes. Notice the two buttons that change the value of route in the context state when they are clicked. Modify the existing file source/app.js. This should render a top component inside an Easy Provider. Easy Provider is given the initial state to be stored in the context. Finally, modify the existing file source/app.css, remove any unused rules, and add rules for the body and input elements. Let's verify that the app works. We're going to return to the default web browser, and then we'll exercise this by entering a username, clicking the report button, and then we'll verify that the username is displayed. Then we'll click back on the form button, change the name again, and verify that that report gets updated. So here's the application running, and I have the DEVTOOLS open, and so I'm going to move focus into the input and type my name, and I see in the console that I have lots of output. Each of the calls to one of the Context Easy methods does this as long as I have the log property provided. And so it's telling me every change that is being made to the state user.name. So now I can click on the report button and I'll see another method call to change the route to report. And now I'm looking at the report component and it's giving me the proper value mark. And I can click back on the form button and now it shows again that the route has changed, this time to form. And so I can change username and go back to report, and sure enough I have the updated value. We've seen how we can use browser DevTools in the console to see messages that are output when the context is modified. We can also see the entire state for each of those. For each of the messages output in the DevTools console from Context Easy, we can click on the disclosure triangle and view the entire state at that point in the app. So we've seen how we can use the browser DevTools to get information about what Context Easy is doing. We also can click on the React tab to get to React DevTools. This of course assumes that React DevTools have been installed in the browser. So to take advantage of this, we simply need to locate the Easy Provider element that we've rendered, and at the bottom here I can see all the data that is inside the context associated with that. And when I open up the user property, I see that it has a name property and it's set to the correct value. For extra credit, try implementing the same app using REDUX or the Context API without using Context Easy. The code will be much longer than what we've shown here. The Easy Provider component accepts props that specify options. To log all state changes in the DevTools console, include the log prop with no value. to validate all method calls made on the context object and throw an error when they are called incorrectly, include the validate prop with no value. These are useful in development, but typically should not be used in production. If the node env environment variable is set to production, the log and validate options are ignored. Other options are specified in the options prop, whose value is an object that specifies their values. The persist option is described on the session storage slide later. The version option is described on the version slide later. And the replace fn and reviver fn options are described on the sensitive data slide later. When the layout of the state changes, it is necessary to change state paths throughout the code. For apps that use a small number of state paths, this is likely not a concern. For apps that use a large number of state paths, consider creating a source file that exports constants for the state paths, perhaps named path-constants.js, and use those when calling context methods that require a path. Here's an example of using this approach. Note the constants defined in path-constants.js and their use in a component below. With this approach, if the layout of the state changes, it is only necessary to update these constants. Typically, React state is lost when users refresh the browser. To avoid this, session storage is used to save all the context state as a JSON string on every state change. This is throttled so session storage is not updated more frequently than once per second. To opt out of this behavior, pass an options object to EasyProvider as shown here. During development, when the shape of the initial state changes, it is desirable to replace what is in session storage with a new initial state. One way to do this is to close the browser tab and open a new one. If this isn't done, the application may not work properly because it will expect different data than what is in session storage. A way to force the new initial state to be used is to supply a version property in the options object passed to EasyProvider. When context-easy sees a new version, it replaces the data in session storage with the initial state value passed to EasyProvider. When the context state contains sensitive data such as passwords and credit card numbers, it is a good idea to prevent that data from being written to session storage. To do this, add replacer fn and reviver fn functions to the options object that is passed to EasyProvider. These functions are similar to the optional replacer and reviver parameters used by json.stringify and json.parse. Both are passed a state object. If they wish to change it in any way, including deleting, modifying, and adding properties, they should make a copy of the state object, modify the copy, and return it. Consider using the Lodash function deepClone to create the copy. A larger example application that uses context-easy can be found in the GitHub repository at the URL on the screen. A nice feature of Redux is the ability to use Redux DEVTOOLS. It supports viewing all the actions that have been dispatched and the state after each action has been processed. It also supports time travel debugging, which shows the state of the UI after a selected action. In truth, I rarely use time travel debugging. As we've seen, the log feature of context-easy outputs a description of each context method call and the state after the call. This is somewhat of a replacement for what Redux DevTools provides. As we saw earlier, React DevTools displays the data in a context when its provider element is selected. This is updated dynamically when the context data changes. Let's review the goals we started with and assess whether they were achieved. Store state in one place that is outside of any component. Context-easy uses a single context, so this goal is achieved. Allow components to access any part of the state. The context object holds all the application state and is directly accessible in components using references like context.user.address.city, so this goal is achieved. Give components an opportunity to re-render if any state they depend on changes. Components that call useContext passing it easyContext are subscribed to changes in the context and re-render when the context state changes. To make this more efficient, add use of the useCallback hook so components only re-render when there are changes they care about. Make it easy for components to modify any part of the state. The context object has methods that support this, such as context.set, passing it path and a new value. do not require any new code to support new state data. When new application state is needed, the only change necessary is to add the initial value of that data where the initial state is defined. When it is acceptable to begin with a value of undefined, no changes are needed. So all of the goals have been met. That's it. I believe Context Easy provides the easiest way to manage state in a React application, much easier than using Redux or the Context API directly. If this approach is appealing but you would rather continue using Redux, check out Redux Easy in NPM. It supports mostly the same API. If you'd like to use this approach in a Vue application, check out Vuex Easy in NPM. This also supports mostly the same API. Thanks for watching. For details on OCI events and training, see the URLs on the screen.